My thanks are to the HRDC of JNU and Professor Sanjay Bharadwaj for giving me this opportunity. I have been asked to speak on India's eastward approaches or eastward engagement, you can call it, which means India's policy approach towards the Southeast Asian countries and countries of the East, which also includes Western Pacific, like Japan, Korea, United States of America. And this is a vast region. Whenever we talk about India's eastward approaches, the general tendency is to look at the beginning in 1991, done by Prime Minister Narasimha Rao when he launched what they call the Look East policy. My feeling is that it is not correct to start in 1991. India is a sun-worshipping civilization, and we have been looking towards East for centuries. Therefore, one has to go back into the historical background and see how this policy has evolved. And if we look towards East, what we find is that the relationship has emerged in various waves and various phases, sometimes being very intense, sometimes not being so intense. And whenever it has not been intense, people have, scholars, policymakers have criticized that, look, India is not doing enough or there is not enough of engagement. But for that, I think the responsibility does not lie with India alone. The responsibility lies with the global context. The responsibility also lies with the regional context. And unless you need two to tango, and unless both the sides are at an understanding with each other, you cannot have a meaningful relationship. Therefore, we must keep this in mind and should not have what you call a categorical assessment whether this country is at fault or that country is at fault. If we look in the totality, broadly speaking, there are several waves or phases in which this relationship has evolved and developed. And depending upon how you really count them. I count mainly, broadly speaking, there are 4 phases. You can convert them into 7, you can convert them into 8, but to my mind, and as we go forward, I will underline these 4 phases. But before we come to these phases, what is it which is significant about East for India? And I think when we look at the idea of the East, there are 4 aspects which emerge very, very clearly. First is that this region on our East is spiritually embedded with India. As I said earlier, that we are a sun worshipper, and therefore right in the morning we look towards East, and that is our civilizational context. Even when you go for yoga or the early morning exercise, Surya Namaskar is largely towards the East. Vastu Shastra, which depends on the housing and other facilities, looks towards East. There are many festivals like Chhat Puja, in which they worship sun and therefore look towards East. Therefore, spiritually, we find a lot of energy coming from the East, and this is where we have the second aspect of civilizational and cultural bondages with the countries of the East. Now, civilizational and cultural bondages are based upon 3 major religions which we have in India: Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and there are living footprints or living icons of this civilizational and cultural bondage which we have had with the East, and even now we look towards them. If you go into various temples in this region, you look at the Ramayana, look at art and architecture, you look Mahabharata and Ramayana being engraved on many of the temples, and this kind of what you call embrace of civilizations of the East and of India had intermingled very smoothly with each other. Economically also, this region is very promising to us. Again, I take you back to 1st century to 18th century, when Indian economy was dominating the world. And when Indian economy was dominating the world, it was mainly depending upon the trade and economic interaction with this region. Recall, we used to call this region as Swarna Bhumi, and India was called the Golden Bird because of the wealth and prosperity which really came up. And even now, since 1990, India's growth is very significantly dependent upon its engagement and interaction with the countries of the East. And lastly, there is a what you call a strategic synergy between India and this region, particularly because of the place which India occupies in Indian Ocean, and we have our what you call territorial sway stretched up to Andaman Nicobar, which is quite in the neighborhood of Southeast Asia. And there is no history of conflict. It is amazing that there is a minor, I'll come to in a short while, except that there is no major distortion in which India is seen as a military power, or some country which has taken the what you call the military missions to this region. As I mentioned, we have the various phases or various waves which are coming up. I said it can be 7, it can be 4, it can be even 8. If you count 4 would be, first I would say civilizational and cultural, which has really come up in the basis of what you call the religions. Hinduism first went, then Buddhism went there, Islam was made an impact by them, then came the British colonial expansion, then Nehru had the Asian solidarity phase, then we came to Look East policy, and finally the Act East policy. For me, I think it is better to take 4 phases or 4 waves, broadly speaking, which will cover all the 7, 8 which I have just identified. The first wave, according to me, is of culture and commerce, in which the whole relationship was dominated by culture and commerce. And you can see many of the footprints of that period even now. It was based upon the religious exchanges, it was based upon cultural exchanges. You see a lot of temples in Southeast Asia which bear that footprint. You go to Cambodia, you have huge Angkor Wat complex which indicates the imprint of Indian Hindu civilization. There is a Ling Parvat in Laos, there are in Lawang Prabang, and also in Angkor Wat, Ramayana and Mahabharata is is scripted in on the walls of the temples. There are Buddhist temples like Borobudur in Indonesia. Similarly, they scattered all around. Though some of those temples have been now converted into Buddhist temples, but the Hindu religion's imprint is very much there. Then there are Buddhist type. Borobudur is, for instance, a Buddhist icon. And I must say that Buddhism broadly went to Southeast Asia via China, rather than going directly from India. But the impact is very much there, and the synergy is very much there. If you look at Islam, the Southeast Asian Islam is a very moderate Islam. It is, one can call it is a secular Islam because of the imprint of Sufism, and that was largely because the West Asian Islam, which went to Southeast Asia, went through India, and a great role was played by what you call the spice trade, which was carried out by many of the Muslims there. So you have Ramayana, you have Mahabharata, you have Sufi impact. Look at the languages, they mostly come from Sanskrit and Pali. Nalanda University played a great role in many of these scholars visiting them. They were travelers, they were pilgrims, they were priests. But as I said, there were no military missions there, except for a brief period of the Cholas. But the Cholas also, that is in around the 10th century, and that also was taken largely to protect their trade interest rather than having any territorial ambitions or controlling people. The trade aspect was very strong. Almost everything was traded. There are examples of even elephants being traded between Thailand and India. but mostly the silk, the textiles, spices, and transit, spice trade. Actually, India offered the transit where spices coming from West Asia went to Southeast Asia. So this economic interaction was very, very strong, and cultural and religious and civilizational ties were very, very strong. And this was a phase which almost continued from 1st century until 11th or 12th, you can say, until the Muslims. And then came, I would say, the second phase, where the British Empire took over in the 19th and 20th century, and as you know, went up to Hong Kong, taking Malaysia into its fold. Their contribution was also very significant. One was in terms of plantation economy, where the palm oil, the tea, or rubber plantations which were established. And as a result of these plantations, many of the Indian indentured laborers went to this region and as workers and got settled there, which now constitutes a diaspora, Indian diaspora, politically very significant in the countries like, say, Singapore or Malaysia. But even otherwise, it went up to the Pacific Islands where great length. The British also brought about a strategic factor of a strategic presence, and this is where the British Army had most of them Indian soldiers who went up to Hong Kong guarding in Singapore. They fought with the countries there, and underlined the significance of Indian Ocean strategically, because British had come to India from the east, and this strategic factor, which was not present earlier, was also very clearly visible when during the British Empire, and that is the second phase. The third phase you can call is of the Nehruvian Asian solidarity, meaning thereby starting after the independence of India. And when India became independent, it wanted to support and actively push forward the independence of many of the other Asian countries in its neighborhood. The two single most examples are Indonesia and Burma. In Burma, because of the internal crisis, also after coming the withdrawal of the British Empire, situation became very precarious. India mobilized Commonwealth support. India even mobilized military support. And there are several references where UNO had said that the assistance given by India was so critical that without that we would not have survived. Indonesia again fought against the Dutch and Portuguese, and there was a big problem of Dutch rule in Indonesia, where Biju Patnaik played a very significant role, and India helped it. India helped not only in organizing the international conference on Indonesia for mobilizing international support, but also took steps to rescue the leaders there, and this is where Biju Patnaik played a role in significant way. Therefore, you find that India during this third wave supported the independence struggles of all these countries. India also organized Asian Relations Conference in 1947, literally just before the independence, even before gaining the independence. And the whole idea was that India and the Asian countries should fight against colonialism, imperialism, and racialism, and regain their confidence and independence. India, as I just now mentioned, had also organized the Indonesian conference, and later on the Bandung Conference of Afro-Asian countries in 1954 for their solidarity. In addition to that, India played a peacekeeping role in Korea and peacekeeping role in Indochina also. But unfortunately, this whole effort during Nehru's time of India to relate itself to Asia and emerge as it had emerged as a leader, but that was pushed into the shadow by 2-3 factors which were very important. One was the Cold War. Then there was a conflict with Pakistan and China, and this neighborhood conflict very seriously affected India's image in Asia. And because of China conflict and also because of Pakistan conflict, in fact, countries like Indonesia, where India had extended such a strong support, came in support of Pakistan and wanted to even help Pakistan militarily against India. That was unfortunate, but these developments took place. And Cold War had divided Asia between what you call the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. And there was no room for Asia to emerge as an independent and powerful factor in global relations. So these were the factors which did not let the Nehruvian initiatives to unfold in a strong way and really make India the leader of this part of Asia. Fourth wave, you can call it, of the Look East. But I must say, and Look East is normally credited to Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, but we must have some understanding of the background in which this is started. And in background, I would draw your attention to two aspects. One is Mrs. Gandhi's period, and the second is Rajiv Gandhi's period. Because Mrs. Gandhi's period, there was an effort to associate India with ASEAN. When ASEAN was formed in 1967, Mrs. Gandhi even sent her Minister of State for External Affairs to see if we could join ASEAN. And the idea was that ASEAN was being mobilized by the US in order to get out of their own Vietnam War, and in the fear that if Vietnam becomes victorious, the whole region would be turned communist, and therefore they want an association of Southeast Asian countries to emerge. Mrs. Gandhi's or India's message was that let us not get into the blocks of communist or anti-communist and have all the countries united under one umbrella of regional organization for development and economic cooperation. But because of the Cold War divisions, that was not acceptable. But then again in 1980, ASEAN decided to accept India. But at that time, India recognized Heng Samrin regime in Cambodia, and that had come out of the Vietnamese intervention against the Chinese-backed forces. And there again, the Southeast Asian countries were divided. And India was about to go to the meeting, but Narasimha Rao, who was then foreign minister, did not go to the Kuala Lumpur meeting, which was organized by ASEAN, and therefore the membership issue did not come up. Now, Rajiv Gandhi had also extensively traveled in Cambodia and did a lot of peacemaking in Cambodia by sending its own Minister of State, Mr. Narwar Singh. The MEA report in 86-87, Ministry of External Affairs report, very clearly stated that this is a region which we have neglected. And mind it, this neglect came out of the Cold War divisions. This neglect came out also because some of the Southeast Asian countries were not willing to interact with India, largely because of the Cold War regions. And India's prestige had gone down after the 62 and 65 wars. So there were factors. And this lean phase in India's relationship with Southeast Asia is often being blamed on India by saying that India had not taken equal interest. What I want to underline is that even during Indira Gandhi's period, even during Rajiv Gandhi's period, India was very clearly interested in interacting with Southeast Asia, but the global situation and the regional situation did not permit. In fact, Rajiv Gandhi knew that the Cold War was now coming to an end. India had a lot of confidence in the neighborhood. You would recall the Indian role in Sri Lanka. You will recall the Indian role in Maldives. And because of this, even with Pakistan, relations were somehow becoming smooth. And India could therefore play a bigger role in region outside. There were also indications of China after 1962, when Deng came to power, was changing its policy and was having very smooth trying to have very smooth relations with Southeast Asian countries, where otherwise China was blamed for supporting the communist insurgencies in Malaysia and other countries. And Deng visited all these countries, and this China's rise, where the region should not come under China's influence, also prompted India to do that, that we must interact with this. And lastly, I would say during Rajiv Gandhi's period in Indian Ocean, there were some Western reports which said India wants to dominate Indian Ocean because it was having a naval panchayat and was building up its navy very strongly. So it was necessary to clear these misgivings and misunderstandings which were there in this region. And that's why the fact should be kept in mind that so far as the whole region is concerned, there was a lot of interest in it, and India wanted to take initiative to have a better and a smooth engagement with each other. It was under these circumstances that I repeatedly say that India has never ceased to become involved and interested in Southeast Asia or in its eastern extended neighbors. Now, this is where what you call the Look East policy started in this context. When Rajiv had taken extended visits to this region, I mentioned Natwar Singh's visit, and mind it, with like visits to China, Rajiv went to Japan, Australia. China visit, he had taken also Narasimha Rao along, and Narasimha Rao was the foreign minister of Rajiv Gandhi. So there is a certain legacy. When Narasimha Rao came to power, between Rajiv and Narasimha Rao, there were two other short-lived governments, one by Chandrasekhar and another by VP Singh. They did not have, they were all involved into domestic dynamics and did not have much of an approach to this region. And that is why when Rajiv Gandhi came, the Ministry of External Affairs reported that we have been neglecting this region and we should start building it up. So it is this legacy which was carried forward. But Narasimha Rao had additional reasons also to vamp up, to emphasize, enforce the approach towards Southeast Asian countries. One was the disintegration of the former Soviet Union, which was one of the closest friends of India. And India was looking for, therefore India was looking for new foreign policy options and opportunities, since the support which earlier was provided by Soviet Union no longer available. Then in 1991, there emerged a serious balance of payment crisis, and India did not have enough money to pay for its imports even for 2 to 3 weeks, and that led to a serious effort to link up economically, open up the Indian economy, bring about the reforms. And in opening up Indian economy, it was decided that it was useful to link up with Southeast Asian countries. So these were the main reasons which further added to what you call the Rajiv legacy for Narasimha Rao to proceed with Look East policy. But here again, it is very interesting that the policy was not entirely economically oriented, as it was mainly made out. And Narasimha Rao made a speech in 1994 in Singapore, which is seen as the landmark speech for opening up of the Look East policy. But I think Look East policy had started even earlier, and the beginning was made strategically, and that too with Myanmar. Because in Myanmar, we were facing insurgency situation where the Nagas and Mizos of northeast insurgencies was spilling over into Vietnam and getting support from their military junta. Largely because India stood for the democratic, military rule had come up in 1962 in Myanmar, and since then the military was dominating there. But India was supporting the democratic forces, and the military regime was not very sympathetic, not favorable to India. So it was necessary to change the policy because of the internal security situation in Southeast Asia and Northeast region, which was linked up, which was very close to Southeast Asia, and China was meddling into these insurgency groups. Many of them were going and seeking shelter in China. China was also promoting Pakistan to have its greater influence in Northeast. And if Pakistan's influence could increase in Northeast, that would have created another serious security problem. And that is the reason why I would say the effort to woo the military junta in Myanmar was necessary. I have visited Bahadur Shah Zafar's grave there, and before I went there were reports of General Musharraf visiting Myanmar and paying almost $75,000 for the renovation of Bahadur Shah Zafar grave. So this influence of Pakistan should not increase in Myanmar was one of the considerations why we wanted to make up with military regime. And I think that can be taken as the first unannounced, unproclaimed beginning of the Look East policy. Then came, as I said, 1994, Narasimha Rao's speech in Singapore, which outlined the economic agenda, economic reforms, and we started having very close relationship on economic front with the countries of this region. Now, this is how the beginning was made in the early 90s. And if you look at the whole policy, it is normally divided into two aspects. First, it was in the beginning, there were two fronts on which this policy worked very sharply. One was the economic front, where trade and investment were emphasized. And second was the organizational front, where linking up with the organizations in Southeast Asia were emphasized. Trade, I said, it started increasing, and it was amazing that India's trade with Southeast Asia started as the fastest growth rate, almost more than 12-13% per annum, which was very impressive. And it started adding to India's economic growth. India's economy started reviving gradually. Many investments also came, particularly from countries like Singapore, though not up to the expectations, but there were many investments came. So both and many of the Indian professionals started going and working in Singapore and some of these other countries. So this phase gathered some momentum. Organizationally, India became a member of ASEAN. To begin with, it became a sectoral dialogue partner and then became full member, and gradually joined all other ASEAN organizations, including ARF, ASEAN Regional Forum, and also the Defense Ministers meeting, ADMM plus 8 other countries which were there. This was the first phase when organizational integration and economic and investment relationships were established. The second phase is being described by, say, in 2003, Yashwant Sinha, who was then Foreign Minister under Atal Bihari Vajpayee. He said, now we have launched the second phase of our Look East policy. And he said in the second phase, it was the strategic aspect which was more important. He underlined that now we will have more defense and security relationship with the countries of the region. There is a big statement which you will see on the PowerPoint which is accompanied with this. The Ministry of Defense report also brought out another aspect and said that China was very fast having relationship with Southeast Asia, and that might lead to the growth in the Chinese influence there in defense matters and may create problem for India in the long run. Now, this report suggests that besides the economic and organizational factors, one of the drivers of strategic front being strengthened or being front loaded on India's Look East policy was also the China factor. Because by then, by 2003, China has emerged as a major power with huge economic growth and a very significant military build-up. So this is how the two phases have evolved, in which a lot of visits have taken place across the borders, and a lot of economic and strategic relationships, which includes military exercises, which includes mutual consultations on critical issues of Indian Ocean security, on counter-terrorism, on what you call the piracies and other issues which were relevant to Bay of Bengal and Indian Ocean. Now, this is how the Look East policy has evolved and flourished. Now, what are the gains of this? What are the gains of this policy? Now, if we start counting the gains, I think regional organizational integration has taken place almost fully. India now is member of ASEAN, of IORA, Indian Ocean Regional Association. There are India-ASEAN summits which have been established. I mentioned that ADMM plus 8, which is a meeting of the defense ministers of ASEAN plus 8 countries, which are the associate or summit partners of ASEAN. They all meet and India is also a part of that. India was also the member of Asian Regional Forum from the beginning itself. Then India became member also of the East Asia Summit, which is of the larger organization beyond ASEAN. India has also encouraged 2 other organizations where China is not present. China is present in EAS, China is present also in ASEAN summits, China is also in other ASEAN organizations, and these 2 organizations are, one is the Mekong Ganga Cooperation Initiative, and the second one was the BIMSTEC, which is Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Economic and Technological Cooperation. So these are the organizations where China was not present, and still they have been encouraged, and I think BIMSTEC is being encouraged much more strongly now by India, as even seen as alternative to SAARC. I don't think it will become an alternative to SAARC, but there is an effort to do it this way. We are also member regularly of the East Asia Summit, where most of the critical issues are being looked into. So the gains of policy was that our regional integration or integration with the regional organizations in this part of the world took place. The second was, as I mentioned, the fastest trade growth and investments, and some of the FTAs have been concluded by this region. And lastly, it is now accepted that India is a major strategic player in the region, in the sense that the countries of the region now expect India to play a much more role. And sometimes they find that India is not forthcoming sufficiently to meet their expectations. Well, I have many times raised this question with my colleagues in Southeast Asia and told them that what is it, where do you find India failing, unless you specifically, there are specific objects. The real problem is, of course, that India's own way of doing things is much slower, less efficient than what it is in Southeast Asia, and therefore it falters or falls short of the expectations of its other partners in many ways. Even within India, we find that many of the projects are not carried out very strongly. They move very, very slowly. But we must keep it in mind that one of the reasons why the Southeast Asian countries are not very happy and not very satisfied by the Indian role is because the growing power and influence of China makes them very uncomfortable, and they want India to match it. I mean, that looks almost impossible, both in terms of economic matters and strategic matters. India cannot match China, and particularly in the economic sphere, Chinese economy is almost 4 to 5 times bigger than that of India's economy, and it is not possible to compare the two or India to match it. And when it is not done, they find that this is what is lacking on India's part. But India's major problem is, which we will come again to this point, is delivery deficit, and therefore there is a lot which needs to be done for India also to see that its objectives of the Look East policy are carried forward. Thank you.